All right, so you're here because you really want to get a grip on the complex stuff, right? And today, well, we've got a doozy. Global trade, tariffs, and yeah, it's a bit of a whirlwind out there.
It really is. It can be tough to sort through it all.
For sure. So that's why we do these deep dives. We dig into all the news, the background, and try to pull out the really important stuff for you.
Yeah, think of us as like, I don't know, your personal guides through this jungle of information about tariffs and global trade and all that.
Exactly. And today we're zeroing in on these new tariffs, the ones the US just rolled out, and how countries like EU and China are reacting, especially with soybeans. It's a whole thing.
Oh yeah, soybeans are a big piece of the puzzle, that's for sure.
So mission control for this deep dive. We're going to nail down the nitty-gritty about these tariffs, how other countries are hitting back, and what the fallout might be, for the economy and for politics, all of that.
Right. And what's really interesting is how you can kind of look at one specific thing, like like soybeans, and see how these big global trade shifts are playing out. It's like a microcosm.
Soybeans, okay. Interesting. So why are soybeans, these little beans, why are they at the heart of this trade war between the US and China?
Well, they might seem kind of humble, but soybeans are a huge deal for the U.S. economy. They're like a cornerstone of American agriculture, consistently one of the top earners. I mean, think about it. Something like 0.6% of the entire U.S. GDP is tied to soybeans.
Whoa, 0.6%. That's way more than I would have guessed.
It's a lot. It's a serious industry. And it's not just, a few small farms here and there. We're talking over 500,000 soybean producers across the country.
Wow.
Yeah, in this 2023 report, it said the industry supports like at least 223,000 full-time jobs. And the whole industry, it's worth a massive $124 billion. I mean, that's like the entire economies of some countries, like Kenya or Bulgaria.
That's a huge number. Wow. Okay, so with all that being said, those soybeans, they must mostly be going overseas then, right?
Exactly. There's definitely solid demand here in the U.S., but exports are the real driver for the soybean industry. The U.S. is, we're number 2 in the world for soybean exports. More than half of all the soybeans harvested here, they get shipped out to something like 80 countries.
Okay.
And for a long time, the biggest buyer, it was China.
So then that brings us right back to those tariffs, right? What kind of an impact have the Chinese tariffs had on all the soybeans going to China?
Oh, it's been a big hit, no doubt. It started with a 10% tariff on U.S. soybeans coming into China, right? Along with a bunch of other agricultural products. But that was just the beginning, unfortunately. It's gone way up since then.
Oh, I bet.
It's been rough. At one point, it was 44%. And now, with all these new retaliatory tariffs, American soybeans are getting hit with a 94% tariff in China.
94%? That's wild. I mean, they're practically doubling the price. How can American farmers even compete with that?
Yeah, it's a massive hurdle to overcome, that's for sure. And what's really interesting is that China kind of saw this coming. They started to shift their soybean imports over to Brazil a while back, like way back in 2017 when this whole trade tension thing started brewing. So whereas the U.S. used to be their main supplier, now it's Brazil that's got over half of the Chinese market for soybeans. Last year, 2024, Brazil's soybean exports to China were worth, get this, $36.6 billion, compared to just $12.1 billion for the U.S.
So basically, U.S. farmers are losing their biggest customer, and Brazil is taking their place. I can't even imagine what that's doing to folks back here in the States.
No, it's definitely causing some real anxiety, that's for sure. You see reports about farmers being worried about whether they can even stay afloat financially. I read about this one soybean farmer in Iowa, and he was saying that if this trade war keeps going past this fall's harvest, we could see a lot of farms going bankrupt.
Oh, wow.
And it's not just the economic side of it either. There are some political angles here that are worth thinking about.
Political angles. Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, EU, right, the European Union, they have also decided to take some action against the U.S. tariffs. And guess what? Made their list of targeted products. Soybeans.
No way.
Yeah. They've approved these tariffs. They go up to 25% on a bunch of American products. The first wave of those tariffs, they kicked in on April 15th.
So now American soybean farmers, they're facing these huge tariff barriers in China, which was their biggest market, and now in the EU too. That's a double whammy.
It really is. And here's something else that's kind of interesting. Almost all the soybeans that the U.S. sends to the EU, they come from Louisiana.
Oh, right.
And guess where the current Republican House Speaker, Mike Johnson, is from?
Louisiana.
Exactly. And even though these tariffs could really hurt his own constituents, he's come out and publicly supported them.
Yeah.
He's saying Americans need to trust the president's plan for the economy.
Wow, that puts those Louisiana farmers in a really tough position, both politically and economically. It sounds like these soybean tariffs are like a way for other countries to apply pressure, in a very specific way.
Yeah, exactly. So let's zoom out a bit now, okay? Let's look at the bigger picture of all these Trump administration tariffs beyond just soybeans. Remember on April 2nd, 2025, when they announced that reciprocal tariff policy? Some folks were calling it Liberation Day.
Liberation Day. That's a pretty interesting choice of words. So, what exactly does this reciprocal policy mean?
Well, basically, it means a 10% baseline tariff on almost every single thing coming into the U.S. That started on April 5th. But the bigger country-specific reciprocal tariffs, those got delayed by 90 days, so they're set to kick in on April 9th.
Okay, so it's like everyone gets hit with a 10% tariff right off the bat, and then potentially even bigger tariffs later, depending on where the goods are coming from. So, were there any exceptions to that initial 10%?
Yeah, there were a few things that got excluded, like books and other informational materials. They weren't included. Same with steel and aluminum products, because they're already under a 25% tariff across the board because of that Section 232 of the U.S. trade law, the one that lets them impose tariffs for national security reasons.
Right.
And then cars and car parts, they also already have a separate 25% tariff. So they were excluded from this new baseline one, too. And then there was copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber, certain critical minerals, energy products, and stuff coming in from Mexico and Canada that's in line with the USMCA, the new NAFTA. Oh, except for anything that's already affected by those Section 232 tariffs, of course. And imports from Cuba, North Korea, Russia, and Belarus, those were excluded too.
Okay, that's a pretty long list of exceptions. So, how do they even calculate these reciprocal tariffs? It sounds like it'd be pretty complicated.
Actually, it's surprisingly simple. And honestly, there's been one of the big problems people have with it. Basically, they take how much a country exports to the U.S., subtract how much it imports from the U.S., divide that number by the total value of U.S. imports from that country, and then multiply the whole thing by 1/2. According to the U.S. Trade Representative, the idea is to even things out and deal with bilateral trade deficits.
It sounds, well, like you said, simple. So, what have economists been saying about this calculation method?
Oh, most of them haven't been too happy about it.
Oh,
Lots of them are saying it's way too simplistic, that it doesn't take into account all the complexities of global trade or all the things that can affect trade balances. Some of them even said it's like the kind of calculation a simple chatbot would come up with. Oh, yeah. And get this. Even one economist whose research was actually cited by the administration, he came out and said that his work was meant to discourage these kinds of policies, and that the administration even, misused his data, which led to these inflated tariff calculations. What a lot of economists are saying is that trade deficits aren't necessarily a sign of unfair trade practices. They often reflect, bigger economic factors, things like savings and investment rates.
it's interesting, too, because even countries where the U.S. has a trade surplus, like Australia, they still got hit with that initial 10% tariff, right? Doesn't really seem to line up with the whole idea of just targeting trade deficits.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It does kind of highlight some of the inconsistencies and criticisms around this whole policy. But anyway, when you announce tariffs like this big, you got to expect some pretty big reactions, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'd imagine the markets would be going crazy.
Oh, they absolutely did. Right after the announcements, the stock markets took a huge nosedive. The S&P 500 had its worst performance since World War II, with 3 days in a row of drops of 4% or more. The only other time that's happened was during the 1987 crash, Black Monday. And the losses during this period, they were actually bigger than what we saw during the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic back in 2020, and even bigger than during the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy in 2008.
Wow, that's a massive impact. So which companies or sectors were hit the hardest?
Well, the ripple effects were felt all over the world, but the U.S. stock market took the biggest hit by far. Those big tech companies, Apple, Google, NVIDIA, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, Tesla, the ones people call the Magnificent Seven, they saw huge drops in their market value. Like Apple, they lost over $500 billion in value in a really short period. And it wasn't just tech either. Those big traditional companies like JP Morgan, Eli Lilly, and Berkshire Hathaway, they took major hits too.
So it's not just the high-tech, fast-growing stuff, but the old guard, too, huh? What about internationally? Did companies outside the U.S. see similar drops?
Yeah, they did, though maybe not as dramatic as in the U.S. Aramco, the big Saudi Arabian oil company, their market value dropped a lot. And in Europe, companies like HSBC, Shell, Siemens, and LVMH, those were some of the biggest losers. And another thing we saw was an initial jump in U.S. bond yields, which is usually seen as a sign of trouble in the economy because it suggests investors are moving away from those safer investments.
So it seems like the immediate consequence is basically widespread economic disruption. So what was the Trump administration's reasoning for doing all this? Why put these tariffs in place?
Well, they gave a few different reasons. President Trump said the tariffs were needed to deal with those longstanding trade deficits and also to bring back pharmaceutical production to the U.S. He was always talking about how the U.S. doesn't make a lot of the essential medicines that people need anymore. And he said these tariffs would make it more attractive for companies to bring that manufacturing back here.
Okay, and how did other countries, especially China, how did they respond to these new tariffs?
Pretty much what you'd expect. They retaliated. China announced a new 10% tariff on all imports from the U.S. starting February 4th. Then on March 4th, they bumped it up to 20%. And then on April 9th, they really upped the ante, minimum 104% tariff on everything coming in from the U.S. And with the extra retaliatory tariffs, some of them even went as high as 125% by April 10th.
125% on all U.S. imports. That's a huge jump from that initial 10%. So which U.S. products did they specifically target?
Oh, it's a long list, covers a lot of key U.S. exports. Coal, liquefied natural gas, oil, agricultural machinery, chicken, wheat, corn, cotton, sorghum, and of course soybeans. Plus they also targeted things like pork, beef, fish, fruits, veggies, and dairy. It's a pretty clear message, hitting back at key parts of the U.S. economy.
Yeah, a direct counterpunch aimed at those sectors we talked about earlier, like agriculture and energy. What about other countries? Any retaliation from them?
Yeah, a few other major trading partners, like Canada and the EU, they also announced their own retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, mostly targeting steel, aluminum, and a few other products. But then there was this kind of surprising thing that happened on April 9th. President Trump announced a delay for some of those retaliatory tariffs, and he suspended the higher reciprocal tariffs for 56 countries. But that initial 10% tariff on imports, that stayed in place.
So a pause for some, but that basic tariff is sticking around for most. That's an interesting tactic. Were there any, really unexpected reactions from specific countries?
Oh, there was this one that really stood out, Zimbabwe. They actually got rid of all their tariffs on goods imported from the U.S. The president of Zimbabwe, he said they did it to try to build a better, more cooperative economic relationship with the Trump administration.
Wow, it's a pretty unusual move in the middle of a global tariff war. What about the political fallout here in the U.S.? Did Congress push back against these new tariffs or support them?
Yeah, there was some action in Congress. Senators from both parties, Republicans and Democrats, they were working on a bill that would make the president get approval from Congress for any new tariffs. But with Republicans in control of both the House and the Senate, it was pretty unlikely that it would actually become law.
So basically an attempt to put some checks on the president's power over trade, but facing an uphill battle. It sounds like this whole thing is creating a lot of uncertainty for businesses and consumers.
Absolutely. And we're even seeing real-world examples of how this uncertainty is affecting decisions. Like Nintendo, they delayed pre-orders for their new gaming console here in the U.S. because of all the uncertainty around the tariffs, even though the release date for the console itself stayed the same. And it's not just big economies either. The textile industry in Bangladesh, which exports a lot to the U.S., they're seeing a big downturn because U.S. buyers are putting a hold on new orders because of the tariffs.
Yeah, it's clear that this is a lot bigger than just a little trade spat. It's having serious ripple effects across the whole world.
Exactly. So to sum it all up, we've seen these new tariffs from the U.S. and then big retaliatory actions from other countries, especially the EU and China. U.S. soybean farmers are in a tough spot, facing tariffs in two of their biggest markets. And globally, things are pretty shaky, with a volatile stock market and a lot of uncertainty about the future. And even though some of those retaliatory tariffs have been put on hold, the trade tensions are still high, and that initial 10% tariff on most imports is still in place.
This deep dive has been really helpful. It gives a really clear picture of what's happening, but it feels like we're only seeing the beginning of it.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it brings up this really important question. With our global economy so interconnected, what are the long-term consequences of all this? The ones we might not even be seeing yet. And not just for the U.S., but for the whole global trade system and for every single one of us as consumers. And another thing to think about is, what role can international trade agreements and diplomacy play in solving these kinds of complex problems? It's a lot to consider as we watch this whole situation unfold.